right, let's take a look at the first paragraph. In a century filled with horrific wars, I have marked out, because I deem it as unnecessary. It doesn't really add anything specific. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I marked as a key idea and put a T to show that it is our topic. Came close to producing the most horrifying war of all, the final failure, in President Kennedy's words. That I was able to mark out and label it as repetitious and unnecessary. We kind of already knew that, the nuclear war was this thing that didn't happen, so this section doesn't really add anything new. The next sentence, how and why the United States and the Soviet Union nudged each other to the edge of the nuclear abyss and how they avoided a suicidal plunge is the paramount story of our age. So this part I did collect as key ideas because it asks a question, how and why did the United States and the Soviet Union nudge each other? And so these are key ideas, and I'm going to hold on to them, but we're going to do something kind of interesting with them in the second paragraph, so hang in there. And then the last part, in Lives Gambled and Saved, it was history's luckiest non-event. I marked this through as unnecessary because, again, if it doesn't add anything new to our knowledge about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can let it go, especially in these first two paragraphs. So here we are. Let's take stock of what we have. This first paragraph, in 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union almost started a nuclear war. This is all the stuff that we already knew about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So then we've moved through that first paragraph and gathered those key ideas, and what we end up with is how and why did the United States and the Soviet Union nudge each other toward nuclear war, and how did they avoid it? Now we're going to find that we're probably not going to hold on to all of this because a question isn't a summary. A question can guide us, but it isn't necessarily something that we're going to hold on to as demonstrating these main ideas. So it's a nice question to ask because it gets our curiosity piqued, and it puts us in the mindset of wanting to focus on learning something new. So this is what we've got after that first paragraph. All right, in this second paragraph, we're going to see some of the same stuff. It was insane, Kennedy remarked, that two men sitting on the opposite sides of the world should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization. But these many years later, the insane possibility still exists. So this is interesting, but it's not something I'm going to add to my summary, so I can get rid of that. The last sentence, however, a new history of the decisions that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis and a close analysis of the decisions that produced its peaceful resolution thus remain compelling and relevant. Now here is what I thought was so cool, because I collected this idea unit and gave it a key idea of what. And it's interesting because what we collected from the first paragraph of the how and why did the US and the Soviet Union nudge each other, this is sort of an answer to that question, that if we look at it anew, create this new history of these decisions. So instead of asking the question, now we're saying we need to pay attention to these decisions because that's what's going to be informing us as we move through the rest of the essay. So now we can sort of revisit. We have the question that we collected, how and why did the US and the Soviet Union nudge each other? Well, now since the next paragraph has given us kind of an answer, we can shape it and change it from a question to a statement. So now we have a new history of the decisions that led to and avoided nuclear war. Help us discover what we don't know. Just a quick reminder about those text structures: description, comparison, contrast, chronological order, cause and effect, problem and solution. Just keep that in your mind. Okay, another quick sidebar. I realized the article we read on the Cuban Missile Crisis was in this shape or structure of description because we are learning particular things about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's one sentence that's coming up that has this signal word at the beginning, the word although. And if you look at your text structure chart, the word although goes with comparison contrast. So even though the essay on the whole is description, this tiny little section, if we think about it like using our text structure and our signal words to guide us, there's something going on in this next sentence that is comparison contrast. So keep that in your mind and let's see if you can figure it out. All right, I know you've wondered in the past why in the world you have to study grammar. Well, here's an interesting reason why grammar is kind of cool sometimes. I told you that the article was written in the text structure description. Well, if you know what the linking verbs are, am, is, are, was, were, being, be, being, been, do, etc., those are your signal words for description. So a lot of times when you see the Cuban Missile Crisis is, whatever follows the is a restatement of the subject, and a lot of times it's a descriptor and kind of a defining type of phrase that you can grab and use as part of your summary. So just thought you'd be so excited about that. I mean, I know you're jumping out of your seats right now. It's just so incredible. Here's the section that I've been leading up to. The first sentence of the next paragraph says, although generally understood as a confrontation between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Cuba, the missile crisis was, linking verb, in fact, far broader in its origins, scope, and consequences. And there's our thesis statement. So you can get rid of that first part, although generally understood as a confrontation between blah, 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 because that's not what it is. It's saying that's almost like the misunderstood part. So you get rid of that first section, and then this comparison contrast, the second part is what's actually true. And that is our most amazing key idea that we collect and our thesis statement. And then far broader in its origin, scope, and consequences than its Russian name, the Caribbean crisis, its Cuban name, the October crisis, or its American name suggests. And those are ideal examples of deleting because they are repetitious. Because, okay, it's interesting to know what the Cuban Missile Crisis was called in the other countries, but it doesn't really add anything brand new that is a key idea to help us better understand what the author is trying to teach us. Here's another quick grammar tidbit for you. It, as a word, as a part of speech, is a pronoun, and it's taking the place of the phrase, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's followed by the word was, which again is a linking verb. So it was, whatever follows that's going to be important. It's telling you something about our topic. So it was what? A global event, an integral part of the wider Cold War, and a consequence of the nuclear arms race that began with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. All of that is really, 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 really important. So we're going to mark global event as a descriptor, key idea, what the Cuban Missile Crisis was a global event, it was an integral part of the wider Cold War, and it was a consequence of the nuclear arms race. So all of those are key ideas that go along with what, and we can now add them to our summary. So I've collected 3 separate summary statements now. The first one was the question, and we decided to let go of the question because it's not really a proper format for a summary. So then the next one we were left with was a new history of the decisions that led to and avoided nuclear war help us discover what we don't know. And that part that says what we don't know, I kind of had a feeling I was going to end up letting go of that because it doesn't feel like it's very novel. It feels like, okay, we've been talking about what we don't know, and it's kind of a given that when we're learning new things, we're going to fill in the gaps of what we don't know. So I've changed it to, instead of a new history, I felt like that didn't really explain what was going on here. So I changed that phrase to a modern view. And that kind of does a better job revealing exactly what's going on here, that as time has gone by, we've learned more things. And in the modern day, this is how we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I narrowed down, including part of our thesis statement. My summary is now, a modern view of the crisis reveals it was broader in its origins, scope, and causes than most people realize. You'll notice that I changed the word consequence in the thesis to causes. When using the word consequences made me originally think that, oh, okay, the consequence of the crisis. But what the author's really saying is the crisis was the consequence, and what we're looking at is what caused that crisis. So in that respect, I just clarified just a little bit to make it easier to understand what we're doing and how we're going to be constructing our summary. One more thing I wanted to share with you before we leave this slide. In my second summary, I have the word decisions, and that word comes up so many different times in this article in so many different ways. And although it is repetitious in that the author uses that word or that concept many different times, and we don't need to include it all those times in our summary, but it's called a repeated reference. And when there's a word or a concept that comes up over and over and over again in an article, it is a clear signal to you that that particular word or that concept is incredibly important to the author. So I didn't want you to confuse deleting something because it's repetitious versus paying attention to something because it is a repeated reference. So that can be a little bit confusing. You don't need to mention it more than once, but if it's mentioned a ton of times in the article, think of it as not simply repetitious, but a repeated reference and something you want to clear summary for certain.